The word Keltoi was Greek. The people it named never used it for themselves. Somewhere around the 5th century BCE, Greek writers began applying it to populations living far to the north and west, strangers at the edge of the known world, organized in ways that confused Mediterranean observers, speaking languages no Athenian could follow. The word traveled, it attached itself to warriors in Gaul, to farmers in Britain, to mercenaries who eventually settled in what is now Turkey. It spread across roughly a third of a continent. And not one of those people, not a single community we can identify through the surviving record, ever wrote it down to describe themselves. That single fact should change everything you think you know about the Celts. Not because it means the history is false, but because it means the story most of us carry. The unified ancient people, the Celtic nation stretching from Ireland to Anatolia, the shared culture bound together by torques and spirals and druidic ritual, was assembled long after those communities were gone by people with very specific reasons to need an ancient ancestor. What I want to show you is how that assembly happened, what it buried in the process, and why the actual Iron Age world it replaced was far stranger and more interesting than the version we inherited. The evidence we are working from here is specific. Greek and Roman texts, Herodotus, Julius Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus form one layer. Archaeological assemblages, particularly the Hallstatt and Latine cultural zones, form another. Modern comparative linguistics establishes the Celtic language family as a genuine historical category. British museum scholarship and current Iron Age research set the boundaries of what those sources can actually confirm. The one thing conspicuously absent from all of it is any text produced by the people themselves identifying a Celtic nation, a Celtic king, or a Celtic people in the unified sense the word now carries. That silence is not a gap waiting to be filled with imagination. It is evidence. Start with the version most people carry, because it did not emerge from nowhere. The image has real components. There were warrior aristocracies across Iron Age Europe who shared recognizable artistic traditions, the flowing geometric designs of Latine metalwork, the prestige of the torque, the feasting culture, the warrior's chariot. The religious specialists, Greeks and Romans, identified as druids. These things existed. Objects stylistically linked to Latine traditions have been found from Ireland to the Black Sea. The broad geographic spread is real. What is not real is the inference that usually follows, that the spread of objects proves the spread of a single people. The popular image solidified further through something entirely outside ancient history. The Celtic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, a period when Welsh, Irish, and Scottish communities were fighting various forms of English cultural and political dominance, reached backward into Iron Age Europe and claimed it. The ancient label became the foundation to modern identity. By the time archaeology developed as a discipline, Celtic was already a loaded category, and excavated objects were sorted into it almost automatically. The mosaic was painted over before anyone had the tools to examine the tiles individually. Here is where the Greek sources actually take us, and it is considerably messier than the popular version. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, is among the first to use Keltoi, and he places them vaguely in the far west of the world, past the Pillars of Hercules, in a geographic gesture more than an ethnic category. He is naming a direction as much as a people. Later writers are more specific, but not more unified. Strabo distinguishes between Keltoi, Galatai, and Galatai in ways that overlap and contradict each other depending on context. The terminology is not a precise ethnic classification system. It is a loose label that different writers apply differently depending on who they were describing and why. Caesar is the most detailed ancient witness to what the Romans called the Celtic world, and what he actually wrote is systematically more complicated than the popular image allows. His Gallic Wars, written in the 1st century BCE, describes Gaul as a territory divided into 3 major groups: the Belgae in the north, the Aquitani in the south, and the peoples in between, who called themselves, in Caesar's account, Celtae. He notes explicitly that these populations differed in language, institutions, and law. He spends enormous effort cataloging the individual tribal communities within each group: the Arverni, the Aedui, the Sequani, the Helvetii, because the political reality he was navigating was not a unified Celtic resistance, but a fragmented landscape of competing loyalties, rivalries, client relationships, and local interests that he could exploit precisely because they did not cohere. This is the detail the popular version quietly removes. Caesar did not fight the Celts. He fought the Gauls, community by community, often playing one against another, and within that campaign, he documented a degree of internal diversity that makes the idea of one Celtic people essentially incoherent. The Aedui cooperated with Rome early in the conflict. The Arverni, under Vercingetorix, eventually organized something close to a unified resistance. But that unity was a political achievement built against Roman pressure in 52 BCE, not an ancient inheritance, and it collapsed almost immediately after Vercingetorix's surrender. There is one more ancient source worth pausing on because it complicates even the geography of the label. Pytheas, a Greek explorer from Massalia who sailed north around 320 BCE, appears in later citations, primarily Strabo, to have used Keltoi in reference to populations in Britain. If accurate, this would push the label's reach earlier and farther than most accounts assume. But the word appears in Strabo's account of Pytheas, not in Pytheas directly, because Pytheas's original text does not survive. We are working from a citation of a lost work, reported by a writer who was often skeptical of Pytheas's claims. The evidence is real but thin, and it should be treated as such, an early and contested data point, not a foundation. Now look at what archaeology actually shows, because this is where the argument against Celtic unity becomes most concrete. The Hallstatt culture, centered roughly in what is now Austria, in southern Germany, and flourishing from around 800 to 450 BCE, is the earlier archaeological horizon associated with the label. It is defined by specific burial practices, material culture, and metalwork traditions. Latene, which begins around 450 BCE and continues into the Roman period, is the later and more geographically expansive horizon, the one most closely associated with the curvilinear art, the warrior equipment, the decorative style that appears across Iron Age Europe. Here is the critical point. Hallstatt and Latene are archaeological categories. They describe assemblages of objects with recognizable similarities. They do not describe ethnic groups, political communities, or self-identified peoples. The British Museum is explicit on this. Objects in Latene style spread widely, but they varied substantially by region. A warrior in what is now France and a warrior in what is now Hungary might both carry objects we classify as Latene, but the communities they belonged to had their own political loyalties, their own histories, and their own relationships to neighboring groups that had nothing to do with shared ethnicity. The objects moved through elite exchange networks, trade, gift, marriage alliance, tribute, and those networks created resemblances without creating unity. Think of it this way. Medieval Islamic geometric art spread from Iberia to Central Asia across communities that were politically hostile to each other, spoke different languages, and had sharply different social structures. The spread of a visual style tells you about contact and prestige and shared aesthetic values. It does not tell you that everyone who used the style belonged to one people. The same logic applies in Iron Age Europe, and it is not a controversial conclusion among specialists. The controversy is why the popular image persists despite it. The answer to that question is where the real story lives, and it begins not in Iron Age Europe, but in a Welsh scholar study in the early 18th century. But before we get there, notice what the first evidence already establishes. The Greeks invented the label and applied it inconsistently. The Romans used it as a military and administrative convenience, not an ethnographic precision. Caesar's own account documents the diversity the label erases. Archaeology shows interconnected but regionally distinct communities, not a nation. And the people themselves left no surviving text claiming the identity. That absence is not a coincidence and not merely a result of poor preservation. The communities of Iron Age Europe did not produce the kind of centralized textual culture that generates self-definition documents. Their records, to the extent they had them, were oral, ritual, and local. What survived was what Romans wrote about them, filtered through Roman purposes. And Roman purposes in describing the Gauls, the Britons, and the other Iron Age communities of Europe had less to do with ethnographic accuracy than with justifying conquest, explaining military campaigns, and managing administrative categories. The label Celt did real political work for the people who applied it. It was not a neutral description. What I find genuinely unsettling about this is not that the popular version is simplified. All popular history involves simplification. It is that the simplification runs in a specific direction, one that makes the ancient world look more like the modern world of nation states and ethnic identities than it actually was. And it does that because the label was borrowed and reshaped by people in the modern world who needed exactly that, an ancient ancestor for a modern political identity. The scholar who changed everything was not a warrior or a king or a conqueror. He was a Welsh naturalist and linguist named Edward Llwyd. And in 1707, he published a book called Archaeologia Britannica that would, with a delay of roughly a century, become the foundation for one of the most powerful identity myths in modern European history. Llwyd was doing legitimate scholarly work. He compared the surviving insular languages of Britain and Ireland, Welsh, Cornish, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Breton, and demonstrated through systematic comparison that they formed a related family. He connected them to the ancient languages of Gaul, recorded in Roman period inscriptions, and to what fragments survived of Celtiberian from the Iberian Peninsula. He called this family Celtic, borrowing the classical label and attaching it to a linguistic grouping for the first time. The linguistic argument was sound. The Celtic language family is real. Comparative linguistics has confirmed and refined Llwyd's basic observation across 3 centuries of scholarship. The languages he grouped together share common ancestry, demonstrable through systematic sound correspondences and shared grammatical structures that could not have emerged independently. When modern linguists describe a Celtic language family, they are pointing at something that genuinely existed, a set of related languages descending from a common ancestor spoken somewhere in prehistoric Europe, probably spreading through a combination of migration, elite adoption, and cultural contact over a long period that remains actively debated. But here is where the trajectory of Llwyd's work diverges from his intentions. He identified a language family. What the 18th and 19th centuries heard was the announcement of a people. The distinction matters enormously. A language family is a scholarly category describing historical relationships between linguistic systems. A people is a political and social identity, something communities claim, defend, and organize around. The two are not the same thing, and assuming they are is the error at the center of the modern Celtic myth. Luid published at a specific political moment. The Acts of Union between England and Scotland had just been signed in 1707, the same year his book appeared. Wales had been legally incorporated into England since the 16th century. The communities whose languages Luid was studying were not abstract historical subjects. They were living populations under real political and cultural pressure, watching their languages lose ground to English in administration, education, and commerce. The idea that Welsh, Irish, and Scottish Gaelic speakers were all heirs to one ancient and noble Celtic civilization, a civilization that had predated Rome, resisted conquest, and maintained cultural continuity for 2,000 years, was not merely flattering, it was politically useful in the most immediate sense. The Romantic movement accelerated everything. By the late 18th century, the figure of the ancient Celt had been absorbed into the broader European passion for noble antiquity, natural wisdom, and pre-industrial authenticity. James Macpherson's Ossian poems, published in the 1760s and presented as translations of ancient Scottish Gaelic verse, became a European sensation despite being largely fabricated. The Welsh Bardic Revival, the Irish Antiquarian movement, the Scottish Highland Romanticism that followed the Jacobite collapse, all of these drew on and reinforced each other, and all of them used Celtic as the organizing category. By the time professional archaeology developed in the 19th century, the Celtic frame was already so deeply embedded in educated European culture that excavators applied it automatically. When an Iron Age burial in Austria or a hoard in France displayed Latène-style metalwork, the label Celtic arrived with the classification, carrying 2 centuries of Romantic assumption inside it. This is the mechanism the popular version of Celtic history does not explain. The ancient label was borrowed, linguistically legitimized, emotionally amplified, and politically weaponized across roughly 2 centuries, producing a modern identity of significant cultural and emotional power. The Irish nationalist movement, the Welsh language revival, the Scottish cultural renaissance, all of these drew on a Celtic identity that was in important respects assembled after the fact, using ancient fragments as raw material for modern purposes. That does not make those movements illegitimate or their cultural claims fraudulent. It means the ancient foundation they claimed was considerably less solid than the edifice built on top of it. Now return to Iron Age Europe with that context in place, because what the modern construction buried is the part that deserves more attention. The actual communities of Iron Age Europe were not a unified people waiting for a name. They were extraordinarily diverse, and the diversity followed real geographic, political, and ecological patterns that the single label Celtic obscures. Take the Galatians, who provide one of the sharpest illustrations. In the early 3rd century BCE, groups of warriors and their associated communities migrated from the Balkans into Anatolia, modern Turkey, and established themselves in the Central Plateau in a region that still bears their name, Galatia. They spoke a Celtic language, or rather a set of Celtic dialects, and maintained recognizable material culture for several generations. Paul's letter to the Galatians in the New Testament is addressed to communities descended from these settlers. But their religious life was syncretic, blending with local Anatolian traditions. Their political relationships were shaped entirely by the competing Hellenistic kingdoms around them. Their material culture shifted toward local forms over time. They were not a Celtic outpost maintaining connection to a Celtic homeland. They were a set of communities with Celtic language heritage adapting to a specific Mediterranean political environment. The Celtiberians of the Iberian Peninsula are equally instructive. The archaeology of what is now northern and central Spain shows communities that fused recognizable Latine material elements with indigenous Iberian traditions in ways that produced something neither purely Celtic nor purely Iberian, a genuine regional synthesis that belongs to both categories only awkwardly. Roman sources called them Celtiberians precisely because they recognized the mixture. The name itself acknowledges that the category did not hold cleanly. Then there are the communities of Britain and Ireland, which the modern Celtic identity most strongly claims as its heartland. The classical record for Britain is thinner than for Gaul. Caesar describes British groups as related to Gaulish communities across the Channel, and the archaeology supports genuine connections through trade, migration, and political alliance. But he does not describe Britain as Celtic in any systematic way. The Pythias reference, which might push the label back to around 320 BCE, survives in contested form through Strabo's account of a text we no longer have. What we can say with confidence is that the communities of Iron Age Britain maintained intensive cross-channel connections, shared some material culture with northern Gaul, and almost certainly spoke languages in the Brittonic branch of the Celtic family. What we cannot say is that they identified themselves as Celts or understood themselves as part of a pan-Celtic world. Ireland is even more striking. The island lay beyond Rome's reach entirely. No Roman army crossed the Irish Sea. That means Ireland escaped the catastrophic disruption that conquest brought to Gaul, the destruction of aristocratic networks, the killing or enslaving of local elites, and the reorganization of territory under Roman administrative categories. Irish society in the early medieval period, when written records begin in earnest, displays a sophisticated legal and poetic tradition, the Brecon laws, the elaborate Philid poetry schools, and the complex genealogical record-keeping with no known parallel in Gaul. These traditions developed on their own terms, shaped by Irish political conditions, not by continuity with some pan-Celtic civilization. Here is the strongest version of the counterargument, and it deserves a direct answer. The linguistic evidence is real, consistent, and established by rigorous scholarship. The Celtic language family exists. Languages in that family were spoken across a substantial portion of Iron Age Europe. Does that not indicate a real Celtic people, or at minimum a common Celtic cultural ancestry? The answer is yes and no, and the distinction is not evasive. It is where the actual history lives. Shared language ancestry indicates common origin at some depth and sustained contact through the intervening period. It does not indicate political unity, shared ethnic identity, or a common civilization in the sense that would make a Celtic nation a meaningful category. Slavic languages form a genuine family descended from a common ancestor spoken roughly 1,500 years ago. That linguistic relationship does not make medieval Poles and medieval Russians one people, does not explain the political and military conflicts between them, and does not mean that Slavic civilization is a useful category for understanding what actually happened in either place. The same logic applies with equal force to the Celtic-speaking communities of Iron Age Europe. What the linguistic argument does establish And what is genuinely important is that these communities were connected through trade, migration, elite exchange, and sustained contact over a very long period. The connections were real. The objects that moved through elite networks, the languages that spread through combinations of migration and cultural adoption, the artistic traditions that traveled across enormous distances, all of this reflects genuine historical relationship. The error is not in recognizing the connections, it is in reading the connections as evidence of a unified people rather than as evidence of a web. And the web, when you look at it directly, was extraordinary. Communities from what is now Ireland to what is now Turkey were in indirect contact through chains of exchange that moved prestige, goods, ideas, technologies, and languages across a continent. That contact produced recognizable similarities without erasing local difference. The Torcs in Irish hordes and the Torcs in Gaulish burials reflect participation in a shared prestige economy, not membership in a shared nation. The Latene spirals on a British shield and on a Danubian helmet reflect the diffusion of a high-status aesthetic through elite networks, not the expansion of one army carrying one culture. The Roman conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BCE broke the western part of that web decisively. Caesar's campaign killed an estimated 1 million. The ancient sources give figures that are almost certainly inflated, but the scale of destruction is confirmed archaeologically through the abandonment of sites, the interruption of material culture sequences, and the reorganization of settlement patterns under Roman administration. The Gaulish aristocracies that had maintained the client networks Caesar observed were destroyed or absorbed. The regional diversity Caesar himself documented was homogenized under Roman provincial administration, which imposed uniform legal and administrative categories on communities that had been distinct. The survivors of that destruction were, by and large, on the periphery, in Britain, in Ireland, in the remaining areas beyond Roman reach. They became, through historical accident, the main carriers of Celtic language traditions into the medieval period. And when 18th century scholars looked for the ancient Celts, they found these peripheral communities and assumed they represented the core. The survivors were mistaken for the origin. The periphery was named the heartland because the actual center had been eliminated. That reversal, the periphery becoming the center because the center was destroyed, is the mechanism the popular version of Celtic history entirely misses. And it means that the modern Celtic identity, however real its cultural and emotional content, is built on a foundation shaped by Roman conquest as much as by ancient tradition. The communities that survived to carry the label were defined as much by what happened to them as by what they inherited. The word survived, the people who first heard it applied to them. That is the strange fact sitting at the center of everything that follows. The Gaulish communities Caesar documented, the Arverni, the Aedui, the Sequani, the hundreds of smaller groups whose names appear briefly in Roman accounts and then disappear, were not exterminated in any simple sense. Their descendants continued to live on the same land, farm the same fields, and eventually speak a Latin that evolved into French. But their political structures were dismantled, their aristocratic networks dissolved, their regional identities absorbed into Roman provincial categories, and the languages they had spoken contracted over centuries until they vanished from the continental mainland entirely. What Rome could not use, it did not preserve. Britain followed a partial version of the same pattern. Roman occupation, beginning in 43 CE under Claudius and lasting roughly 4 centuries in the southern and central regions, disrupted but did not fully eliminate Brittonic-speaking communities. The Northwest northwest and the far north remained largely outside Roman administrative control. When Roman authority withdrew in the early 5th century, the political vacuum it left was filled in different ways in different regions by surviving local elites, by incoming Anglo-Saxon communities in the east and south, and eventually by a complex reorganization of territory that pushed Brittonic-speaking populations toward Wales, Cornwall, and what is now Brittany in northwestern France. That western contraction is not a story of Celtic retreat. It is a story of specific political and military pressures producing specific demographic outcomes over several centuries. Ireland, which Roman armies never reached, developed along a trajectory entirely its own. The early medieval Irish legal tradition, the Brecon Laws, codified in texts dating from roughly the 7th and 8th centuries CE, but almost certainly drawing on much older oral tradition, represents one of the most elaborate, customary legal systems in early medieval Europe. It governed inheritance, contract, injury compensation, the status of poets, the obligations of clientship, and the relationships between competing kingdoms with a precision and sophistication that has no direct parallel in what survived from Gaul. When scholars describe this tradition as Celtic, they are using a linguistic category. Irish belongs to the Goidelic branch of the Celtic language family, but they are not describing a tradition continuous with the warrior aristocracies Caesar observed in Gaul. They are describing something that developed in Ireland, shaped by Irish conditions, across a period when Gaul had already been Latin-speaking for centuries. This divergence matters because it is one of the clearest illustrations of what the single label Celtic actually costs in historical precision. The Irish legal tradition and the Gaulish warrior culture of the 1st century BCE are both called Celtic. They shared a common linguistic ancestry at some depth. They had almost certainly been in contact through trade and migration during the Iron Age. But by the time the Irish texts were written, the world they described had been developing independently for at least 500 years, shaped by a set of political, religious, and ecological conditions that had nothing to do with what happened in Gaul after Caesar. Treating both as expressions of one Celtic civilization is like treating medieval Icelandic law and medieval Portuguese law as expressions of one Germanic civilization, because both descended from Indo-European languages. The common ancestry is real. The implied continuity of culture and identity is not. The medieval period adds another layer that the popular Celtic narrative tends to absorb without examining carefully. When Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, transmitted through Roman Britain and continental connections, it did not simply replace existing practice. It interacted with the existing legal and literary traditions in ways that produced something distinctive: the Irish monastic tradition, with its unusual organizational structure, its emphasis on scholarship and manuscript production, and its missionary energy that sent figures like Columbanus and Columba into Scotland and continental Europe. This tradition is sometimes described as Celtic Christianity, implying a form of Christian practice rooted in ancient Celtic spirituality. The historical record does not support that framing. Irish Christianity was shaped by Irish monastic organization, specific historical circumstances, and particular contacts with the broader Christian world. It was not the survival of pre-Christian Celtic religion in new clothes. The Druids are the clearest example of how modern Celtic identity retrofits ancient labels. Greek and Roman sources describe religious specialists among the Gaulish communities, individuals with authority over ritual, law, and learning, described variously by Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Caesar. Caesar's account is the most detailed and almost certainly shaped by his political purposes. He describes the Druids partly to explain Gaulish social organization to a Roman audience and partly to justify the scale of his campaign. What the sources actually establish is the existence of a specialized priestly and learned class in certain Gaulish communities of the 1st century BCE. What they do not establish is anything about Druidic practice in Britain or Ireland, where the textual record is entirely absent for the Iron Age period. The Druids of modern Celtic imagination, the white-robed figures at Stonehenge, the guardians of ancient wisdom, the practitioners of nature-based spirituality, are almost entirely a creation of the 18th century revival. Stonehenge was built roughly 2,000 years before the period associated with Latine culture, and there is no evidence connecting it to any practice that could be called Druidic. The modern Druid orders that conduct ceremonies at Stonehenge today were founded in the 18th century, drawing on classical sources, romantic imagination, and the same nationalist revival that produced the broader Celtic identity movement. They are a living cultural tradition with genuine meaning for their members. They are not a survival of Iron Age religion. What the 18th and 19th centuries actually built, across all of this, the linguistic recovery, the romantic imagery, the archaeological classification, the nationalist movements, was a retroactive nation. It was constructed with genuine scholarly components, real linguistic evidence, authentic cultural continuity in the surviving language communities, and enormous political and emotional investment. The construction worked. Celtic identity became and remains one of the most powerful cultural identities in the modern world. Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Breton, and Cornish cultural movements have used it to resist assimilation, preserve languages, maintain artistic traditions, and assert political claims. Languages that might otherwise have died, Welsh most visibly, survived partly because the Celtic revival made them matter in a new way. The cost of the construction was the actual Iron Age world it claimed to represent. When you organize a continent's worth of diverse Iron Age communities under one label and then backfill that label with modern content, nation, shared identity, spiritual tradition, unified resistance to Rome, you lose the specific texture of what was actually there. You lose the Galatians adapting to Hellenistic politics in Anatolia while maintaining Celtic language speech for several generations. You lose the Celtiberians producing a material culture that belongs to neither pure category. You lose the hundreds of Gaulish tribal communities whose internal politics Caesar spent 8 years exploiting because they would not cohere. You lose the Irish legal tradition's specific development over 5 centuries of independent history. You lose the genuine diversity of the web and replace it with the imagined unity of the nation. And here is where the final reinterpretation lands, because it is not simply a correction. The popular reading asks whether the Celts were one people and answers yes, on the basis of shared culture, shared art, shared spiritual tradition, and shared resistance to Rome. The evidence answers no. The unity was imposed from outside by Greek and Roman label makers, then reconstructed from the inside by modern identity movements, and the ancient communities it claims to represent were far more diverse, competitive, and regionally specific than the unified image allows. But the more interesting answer is that the question itself may be the problem. The Iron Age communities of Europe were connected through a web of trade, elite exchange, linguistic relationship, shared artistic tradition, and sustained contact across enormous distances. That web was real. What it produced was not unity, but resemblance. Communities that shared enough material culture and linguistic ancestry to be recognizable to each other and to outside observers, while remaining politically distinct, often hostile, and deeply shaped by local conditions. The word Celtic is useful as a shorthand for that web. The error is in mistaking the shorthand for a description of a nation that actually existed. What the label has never been able to contain is the most revealing thing about it. The Galatian community that survived in Anatolia into the early centuries CE was Celtic-speaking but Hellenistic in its political culture and syncretic in its religion. The Irish monastic scholars of the 7th century were Celtic-speaking but shaped by a Christian intellectual tradition that connected them more immediately to Rome and Egypt than to anything in Iron Age Gaul. The Welsh poets who preserved Brittonic language literature through the medieval period were operating in a political world defined by Anglo-Norman pressure and internal Welsh dynastic conflict, not by continuity with an ancient Celtic civilization. Each of these communities was real, particular, and shaped by forces that had nothing to do with belonging to one people. The label attached to all of them cannot hold all of them.